concepts of peace, love, and joy into a new year. So I thought I'd start out with just a brief history lesson on resolutions. It's generally accepted by historians that the concept of a New Year's resolution actually came from the Babylonians. As for the Babylonians would start a new year, it was a good time for them to return borrowed items such as farming equipment. So those of you who have someone's lawnmower in your garage, or maybe perhaps a game you've borrowed from somebody that you've had for 3 weeks or things like that, this is a good time to return it. And also to pay debts so that they could start off the new year with a clean slate. Some also believe that the Babylonians made New Year's resolutions as a way to negotiate or bargain with their gods. And that somehow their gods would show them favor, if they were for a good harvest or for a plentiful year. So as Christians, the Bible does not speak for or against the concept of a New Year's resolution. But it is very clear how God expects us to treat our promises. And so that's really what we really want to talk about today is how do we as Christians keep and uphold our promises to God. In Psalm 118:24, the psalmist says, "We will rejoice and be glad in it," referring to the day. We will rejoice and be glad in it. And after you make a resolution or a promise to yourself any day of the year, it's in your hands to keep it or break it. So one of the things that the Bible does say, let's look at Ecclesiastes 5, 2 through 4, that if one does make a promise or a vow to God, it shouldn't be taken lightly. "Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than you should vow and not pay." So with the start of a new year, it's natural to want to start the year with a clean slate. This is the year I'm going to lose weight. I say that every year. This is the year I'm going to focus on my marriage. This is the year that I'm going to keep my house clean. This is the year that I'm going to actually wash my car occasionally, or all those things. They're all things I say every year. So, it's often that we kind of look at our lives at this time of year and say, okay, these are the messy parts of my life I want to clean up. But what we don't often do is step back and look at what is the motivation behind that. What's the motivation that would drive us to want to clean up those elements of our life? Maybe some things that you've looked at is, I need to pray more. I need to read my Bible more. Or maybe I need to volunteer more. These are all great resolutions as well, but without the proper motivation, they're going to end up in failure. So that leads us to today's title, which is Christ in Us. So as we've looked at the sermon series to this date, and we've looked at Christ's coming, Christ's birth, and his arrival on the planet, this leads to something more than just a celebration of Christ's birth. This leads to a celebration of salvation, a celebration of hope, a celebration of peace and joy. That Christ came to us, and his redeeming work on the cross led to amazing changes in our life. And accepting Christ into your life should make changes in you. Taking that hope into your heart, taking that joy into your heart, should begin to lead to changes in your heart. It's like shining a flashlight into a dark room, right? That hope comes in, and it starts to uncover the dark recesses of your heart and allows you to see clearly what's in there. Sometimes we don't want to see what's in there, right? That's the scary part. And typically, if you shove something in a dark room, it's because you don't want to deal with it either. So what we're going to look at today is, how does Christ motivate us to keep our resolutions and our promises? In Galatians 2:20, the Apostle Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life and the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself to me. You know, in this verse, Paul says, Christ lives in me. How does Christ live in us? How do we see that expressed in your day-to-day life? What does he wish us to do? You know, it's as a church that focuses on how we create disciples. What is the discipleship process? How do we talk to non-Christians? This is an important part of your testimony, right? I mean, to be able to tell people, Christ came, he came to this earth, he lived for us, he died for us. That's great, now what? You know, as your testimony, you need to be able to talk about, what is that next step? What does that look like? What does it mean to have Christ in us? You know, and as all such answers, or I should say as all such questions are answered, luckily God gave us very clear directions in the Bible. So I'm going to turn to John 13, 34 through 35. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So we're going to start with just a very basic premise here that Christ repeats throughout the Bible. And I think I repeat it every single time I'm up here in front of you guys. And I know Jason as well, which is Christ made it very clear over and over again in the Bible through his commandments that he has a simple expectation of us, which is to love one another. And to take that a step further, to love your neighbor more than you love yourself. That's a very solid foundation for us to build our faith on, right? Christ came, Christ loved us enough to die for us. And Christ expects us to love one another in that same way. So it's even a step further beyond that Christ actually gave us a definition of love. Because he knows we as people are kind of stupid. And even though that you would think that would be a concept that would be easily described, he knows that we have failings in that area. And so this is probably one of the most read verses in the Bible. But I want to repeat it today with a counsel that sometimes I think we feel like we know the Bible too well. You know, sometimes I think there are verses in the Bible that we hear all the time, and we just start ignoring them when we hear them. And I think 1 Corinthians is one of those verses that you hear it in weddings, right? Almost every wedding you go to, 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8 is read, right? And so you just start tuning this out. But let's read this together. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoings, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. I asked my boys something. Does my love look like this all the time? Does my love never arrogant or rude? See them very quietly shaking their head no? Right. Right. So, God, Jesus Christ loved us so much that he gave us a very clear definition of what love is. He said, I expect you to love one another And this is how I expect you to do that. This is the definition. This is what I expect you to do. Right? It's not envious or boastful. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. So let's take this and let's bring this back to resolutions. How do we apply Jesus' commandment to love one another to our own resolutions for a new year? That's the hard part, right? So when I look at a New Year's resolution based on a Christian gospel of what Christ himself has said we should be doing, how can I look at creating something sustainable for my year that I can actually live out? You know, I may struggle with going to the gym 3 times a week. But how can I create a consistent gospel transformation in my life that I can carry out throughout the year? So to answer that question, I'm going to go to a much smarter man than myself, Jonathan Edwards. Those of you who are familiar with Jonathan Edwards, know kind of why I'm going here. But for those of you who aren't, Jonathan Edwards was a Christian preacher, philosopher, a theologian, who lived around 1703 till 1758. And Edwards is acknowledged as one of America's most important and original philosophical theologians, one of the greatest Christian intellectuals in the country. And his work was broad in scope, but he was rooted in a Reformed theology. And when Edwards was a young man, he sat down and wrote down a series of thoughts and practices to help him cultivate and grow in grace. And when you go to 2 Peter 3:17 through 18, and you look at where Edwards was coming at in what he was doing here, it says, "You therefore, beloved, knowing this beforehand, take care that you are not carried away with the error of lawless people and lose your own stability, but grow in grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. To him be the glory, both now and to the end of days." And so what Edwards thought was, you know what? I'm going to take this seriously, and I'm going to really set out what are all the ways that I can make this verse live out. How can I apply this to my life in such a way that I can be successful? And so what Edwards ended up with was over 70 resolutions that he set out, and he would read these every day to remind himself of what it was that he vowed to God he was going to do. One thing Edwards knew that we often forget is, if I make a vow to God, I need to take that very seriously. The vow to love and cherish our wife in the marriage relationship is made to God, right? And just in that way that we should take that seriously, Edwards looked at this series of resolutions and said, this is critical to my life. This is critical to my discipleship. So the result of this was a very humble man, a very godly man, who would become one of the greatest theologians in this country. Now, I'll preface this by saying I'm not expecting the people in this room to write down 70 resolutions and keep them. So don't get nervous. But Edwards is a great role model. Someone that we could look up to and say, he did this. He was able to do this and do great things out of this. In those times where I feel like I just can't do it, it's good to have somebody like this to look at and say, wow, he kept 70 resolutions. That's pretty darn good. So we're not going to go through all 70 of these because we only have a short amount of time here. So what I want to do is I want to really focus on the first one. And the first resolution is in 4 parts. So let's just read this together. Resolve that I will do whatsoever I think to be most to God's glory and to my own good, profit, and pleasure in the whole of my duration. Resolve to do whatever I think to be my duty and most for the good and advantage of mankind in general. Resolve to do this, whatever difficulties I meet with, how many and how great soever. And resolved never to lose one moment of time, but improve it the most profitable way I possibly can. And Steve, just leave that up for me. So I want to break this down into two parts, all right? So the first part being the first two resolutions that he has here. Resolve that I will do whatsoever I think to be most to God's glory and to my own good, profit, and pleasure in the whole of my duration, and resolve to do whatever I think to be my duty and most for the good and advantage of mankind in general. And so what he's done here in this first part is he's established what is my service to God. As a resolution, where do I start? I start by looking at what is my service to God. And what Edward just stated here is my first step is to bring God glory, first and foremost. So as we look at how we form a resolution for next year, how we create a discipline within ourselves to approach life in such a way that's different, that shows the work that Christ is doing in our heart. I think Edwards set a great example here for us by saying, okay, step number one, focus on glorifying God. Now you notice he says here, for my own good, profit, and pleasure as well. And that's a great statement because what he's saying here is, I understand that by glorifying God, it will be to my benefit as well. Right? To God be the glory. And from that will come fruit. In his second statement, resolve to do whatever I think to be my duty, and most for the good and advantage of mankind in general. So first he said, I'm going to glorify God. And then second he says, I'm going to serve others. I'm going to do whatever I can to serve mankind. That may be a small thing. That may be eating lunch each day with the guy at the office that doesn't talk to anybody, right? That may be big things. It may be leading an effort, a volunteer effort. It may be stepping in and leading in your church. You know, Edwards doesn't put a classification on this, right? And I think when we make our own resolutions, sometimes we reach too far. Like I think my best example is typically I'm going to go to the gym 5 days a week, right? I've set an unclear goal for myself there, or an unreachable goal. There's no way I'm going to do that, right? But, you know, when Edward says, for the good and advantage of mankind in general, you know, what he's saying really is, I'm going to take the opportunities that God gives me. Each and every day, God gives me an opportunity to serve somebody. And I'm going to do it. I'm not going to pass it up. So if we just break down these first two, glorify God, serve mankind. I think that's a great start for a New Year's resolution. Right? Yeah. And then something that I can look at every day and remind myself, oh, this is what I'm doing. This is my purpose. This is how I want to start my day. Now, the thing I love about this first set of resolutions here is how Edwards wraps this up here. Resolve to do this, whatever difficulties I meet with, how many and how great soever. You know, so he's making it clear here, this is going to be hard. This is not going to be easy. You're not going to wake up in the morning, go out and serve people, and not hit stumbling blocks. You're going to call people, and they're not going to want to go to lunch. You're going to want to tell your story to somebody, and they're not going to want to listen. Right? But resolve to never lose one moment of time, but improve it the most profitable way I possibly can. And I love how he just very succinctly and very easily pulled this whole thing together by saying, you're going to fail, but don't lose a moment of time thinking about it, right? Move on. Move on. So you couldn't get your neighbor to open the door. Try again tomorrow. So you couldn't get that introvert at church to go to lunch with you. Try again tomorrow, right? It's not something that we have to just try once and give up on, is what he's saying. Never to lose one moment of time, but improve it the most profitable way I possibly can. And let's look at that phrase, the most profitable way I possibly can. Because even in failures, we learn. right? In fact, I think, the more seasoned of us in the room who are older and longer in the tooth, I'm not looking at anybody in general. Dave, no. Will tell you, you often learn more from your failures than your successes, right? Is that not true? The question is, when we say profitable, what does that mean? It means taking a look at that failure and learn from it and move on. Don't hold it in your heart. Don't hold it as the example of why you can't make things happen. Make it profitable. Make it something that you can use. Take that failure and turn it around and say, why didn't this work? What could I do better next time? How can I improve on this? Learn from that and then put it away. You must accept that you will fail. Joshua 7 is a chapter in the Bible that talks about how to deal with failures and how God expects us to deal with failures. Achan disobeyed God. He kept some spoils from war that he should not have. So Israel is defeated in their next battle. It's his fault, right? Joshua is crushed. He rips open his shirt, he throws himself to the ground, and he wails before God. And God comes and is amazingly matter of fact in the matter. He simply says, "Get up. Why are you on the ground?" I love this, one of my favorite verses. Israel has sinned. That is why they got beat. Get up and get rid of the sin. How lovingly clear is that? Let me read it one more time. Get up. Why are you on the ground? Israel has sinned. That is why they got beat. Get up and get rid of the sin. So this is a great verse to have in the back of your head when you reach adversity, when you have struggles. Get up. Why are you on the ground? I mean, God clearly said it to us right there. Get up off the floor, pick yourself up, and try it again. Get rid of the sin in your life, and look at how to do it better. In Proverbs 4, 25 through 27, Solomon kind of gives us a direction here. Let your eyes look directly forward, and your gaze be straight before you. Ponder the path of your feet, then all your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil. And what God's saying to us here is remain steadfast. Right? One foot in front of the other. Stray away from evil. Keep your path straight. Each and every day is one foot in front of the other foot, keeping down a path that eventually leads to a place where I can look back on my failures and not feel regret, right? I can look back on past mistakes and not feel like I have failed God, right? Each footstep on that path takes me further and further away from myself and closer to Christ, right? And that's our destination. That's where we're going. So as Edwards resolved, I resolve that I will do whatsoever I think to be most to God's glory. Wallowing in our defeat is not to God's glory. So I'm going to read Isaiah 43. Remember not the former things, nor consider the things of old. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. And isn't that a beautiful sentiment? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert, because he's God. He can do that. He can do all things. He can do great things. If God can create an earth, if God can create a man and put him on that earth, and God can create a woman to be with that man, do you think God can overcome your obstacles? Don't you think God is big enough to handle your burden? He's telling you right here. He's making it very clear. I will make a way in the wilderness. So let's go back to our walking, right? We're walking a clear path. a big part of that is trusting that God is laying that path for us. You know, that I'm not forging that myself. I'm not here with machete, knocking all these things down myself. God's forging that path for me. He laid it out before the beginning of time for me. And I can trust that it's somewhere that he wants me to go. In Proverbs 3, and again, one of my favorite verses, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. And again, when we look at how this kind of ties Edward's resolution together, and Edward says, I'm going to start out my day by remembering that I need to glorify God. And I'm going to do the best I can to help mankind. What this verse in Proverbs is saying is, you know what, you can do that because you can trust in me. I'm going to help you. That doesn't mean you're not going to face adversity. That doesn't mean that you're not going to stumble, but I'm going to be there for you when you do. And then Philippians 4:6, Christ says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And this is so important as we look at how we make our resolutions successful for this year. It's prayer. Right? Prayer. We have to turn it up to God. We have to come to him and say, God, I cannot do this by myself. And I don't know about you guys, but I find myself in this place where I'm facing adversity, whether it's at work or stuff going on at church or in my family. And I start down a path and I have to stop myself and realize I haven't prayed for this. Why have I not prayed for this? Do you guys have that experience? Peter's shaking his head, so I know he is. But, you know, sometimes we just have to stop ourselves and say, I've got to turn this up to God. I cannot do this by myself. I cannot do this without my wife. I cannot do this without my kids. I cannot do this without my church. I can't do this by myself. I will never be able to do this by myself. And it's a promise God has made to us. When we read Jesus' words, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And there's times where I read the Bible and I'm overwhelmed by the affection Jesus shows for us. Just the love and the tenderness that Christ shows for us. That should be a great, great comfort when we stumble, when we fall. Because he makes it so clear in all of his preachings, I know you're going to do that. I know you're going to fall. But it's okay, I'm going to be there. I'm going to hold you. I'm going to pick you up. The gospel reminds us that Jesus was punished for our failures, that Jesus absorbed that pain for us, that Jesus was able to take something on himself that we would never be able to bear. Right? The gospel calls you to remember what Jesus' work accomplished for you. As Jared said, as he was reading the verses this morning, by grace you have been saved. So I'll add into that verse, not that I think it needs to be added to, but by grace you've been saved, so get up off the floor. Get up and do something. Move forward. Go out. Get out of your comfort zone. Glorify God. So I would encourage all of you guys, as you look at your resolutions this year, stay away from I'm not saying stay away from the gym, but look at where your motivation is. And I think we've got a great teacher here in Edwards who made it pretty clear for us. Start out with glorifying God. And love each other. And don't be afraid to fail when the time comes. So as we move into our worship set, I just want to speak a little bit to the first song that the band's about to pray, How Beautiful the Blood. I just want to read a verse out of this. Never knew through these nails would love unfold, and never knew these wounds would heal my soul. I've never seen such beauty and sorrow meet. The blood of Jesus was blood for me. So as we sing this today, as the band's getting ready to come up and perform this song for us, think about these words and how you can carry this throughout the rest of your year. How can I take this sacrifice and show people what it means for me? That it's not just words on a page. It's not just a story. Christ came, he did a work for me, and it changed my heart. It made a difference. And I want you to see how it made a difference. So let's pray.